17. Callan. The jet was 40 minutes from Florence when my mobile buzzed. "Sir, Miss MacLeod and Professor Innes left the hotel on foot. They've arrived at a restaurant called the Copper Chalice. It's approximately 5 minutes from the conference venue." My hand tightened on the armrest. "The Copper Chalice?" "Yes, sir. I've confirmed the reservation. Table for 2, 2100 hours." "Where are you?" "Front entrance. Landau is covering the rear." "Keep me updated." "Roger that." The Copper Chalice name was familiar. Most people who dined there never learned what the building also housed. The main floor was a restaurant with excellent food and an expensive wine list, the sort of place where a professor would take a colleague after a conference to impress her. Guests came through the front entrance, ate, paid, and left without ever knowing that above the palazzo was a private club, much like the Thorned Thistle. Marco Benedetti, codename Conclave, ran both sides of the venue. He'd been an operative for AISE, Agenzia Informazioni e Sicurezza Esterna, Italy's equivalent of MI6, for as long as I'd known him. I'd met him through the intelligence organization, then got to know him better via a network of vetted clubs. I trusted the man with my life. Under his roof, all scenes were monitored, members screened, and lines of consent enforced. Isla having dinner there could be that simple. There was no reason to assume the university professor from Fjordheim she was with had ever heard of Benedetti's club, let alone had access to it. However, listening to my gut had kept me alive during missions and ops that might have proven deadly if I hadn't followed my instincts. The last thing I'd do would be to ignore them now, when they were screaming at me to protect Isla. I landed at a private airfield south of Florence at 2300 hours. A car was waiting on the tarmac, and I was in it before the engines wound down. On the 12-minute drive, I rang Rampart. "Anything I need to know?" "Negative, sir. Neither Miss MacLeod nor Professor Innes has come through either door." "I'm 5 minutes away." The Copper Chalice was on a narrow street near the river. I'd been here twice before. When the maitre d' greeted me at the door, I told him I'd find my own way and didn't wait for his response. Inside, the dining room was candle-lit and half full. I went through it, checking the tables. Neither Isla nor Innes was seated at any of them. 2 empty wine glasses sat on one near the back wall. One had lipstick on the rim. I continued down a corridor off the right side of the dining room. At the end of it, a man stood next to another door. He recognized me, spoke into his comms, then held it open and ushered me inside. Like my trek from Dunraven to the Thistle, the farther I walked from the restaurant, with its clatter of conversation and waiters dodging each other between tables, the more I transitioned away from the roles of friend and operative that I'd played over the last several days. By the time the space opened, and the Copper Chalice spread out in front of me, I was Master Callan. Benedetti had rehabbed the palazzo like we had the distillery. He'd preserved the vaulted ceilings and marble floors that had been worn smooth by centuries of use. What he'd built inside served a purpose the original architects couldn't have imagined. Iron sconces that had once held torches now cast electric light. A long bar carved from a single slab of walnut ran down the length of one side, and dark fabric hung from the walls to partition the space where privacy was needed. The furniture was purpose-built. Padded leather benches sat alongside oak frames fitted with anchor points for restraints. Some pieces looked like antiques until you noticed the hardware. Conclave was waiting at the foot of the staircase with a glass in each hand. He pressed one into my palm and embraced me. "It's been too long," I said. "It has. How are you?" "I've had easier weeks. How are you, Marco?" "Better now that you're here. When Enzo radioed that Renegade was at my door, I thought he was joking." He studied me. "You look like hell." "It's been a long week." "So I've heard. How is Archon?" "Recovering." "Good. Give him my best." He lifted his glass, I raised mine, and we drank. Any other night, I'd have chatted with him for an hour. Tonight, each second I spent on pleasantries was a second I wasn't finding Isla. Listen, I'm looking for a woman with red hair, late 20s. She was in the restaurant tonight with an older man. Have they come through to this side? I only arrived a few minutes ago. Let me check with my floor monitors. He retrieved his mobile from his jacket pocket. Rather than wait, I continued to the main floor with the glass of whiskey I barely tasted and nodded at faces I recognized from clubs across the continent. Beautiful people made small talk, while an undercurrent of anticipation ran beneath the surface. I climbed the curved staircase to the observation gallery that overlooked the main salon. A handful of guests sat or stood, watching the scenes below. I found a spot in the shadows and looked down. Below me, there was wax play on the far side of the room. The Dom worked with coloured candles at a height that told me he understood how wax cooled in the air before it met the skin. His sub lay on a padded table, with her arms at her sides and her fingers loose. She flinched each time a drop landed, but her body stayed open. The second was a rope suspension near the centre of the room. The rigger had his sub in a partial inversion, with her weight distributed across her hips and chest. The jute was dyed dark, and the pattern was a variation that I'd seen used at the Thistle. The sub's eyes were closed, and her lips were parted. Her body swayed when the rigger adjusted the tension line, and she moved with it instead of against it. Trust like that took months to build. It showed in how she'd given him her weight without hesitation. The third was against the back wall, obscured by a stone column that supported the gallery above it. I shifted to the left to get a better view. A woman was bent over a spanking bench, with leather cuffs around her wrists and ankles, and welts from a flogger crossed her bare back. A man stood behind her and worked her with the falls. I leaned forward to get a better look at the uneven wounds. A few ran diagonally across her spine, which meant the Dom had either lost his angle or never had one. A competent master could lay 10 strokes in parallel lines without thinking about it. These were scattered. Some were too high, some crossed over previous marks, and one was close enough to the sub's kidney that it should have been stopped before it landed. The Dom executed the scene with mechanical competence, but nothing more. He worked the sub like a piece of equipment, striking, repositioning, striking again. He wasn't reading her at all, not tracking her breathing, nor as much as looking to see if she was wet. The submissive was equally disconnected. Her fingers had been curled when I first looked, not in the grip of arousal, but the curl of withdrawal. By the time I'd counted the welts, her hands had gone slack on the bench grips. They hung loose over the edges of the leather, as if the tendons in her hands had been cut. I knew what subspace looked like, and this wasn't it. When it happened, the body softened, but it didn't shut down. A sub who was under would grip and release, matching the pace of what was being done to her. This woman's hands weren't doing anything at all. The rise and fall of her chest were shallow and irregular. It had nothing to do with the strokes landing on her back. She'd been drugged. Nothing else explained it. Another stroke landed, and she absorbed it without resistance. He struck again, and her shoulders rolled with it. Taking a hit without muscular response wasn't a choice. She'd gone somewhere inside herself. It wasn't surrender, this was endurance. She was waiting for it to be over. She hadn't safe-worded, and she wasn't going to. Not once had he spoken to her or asked for her colour. He hadn't so much as paused to check on her. He was striking a woman who wasn't present, and he either didn't know or didn't care. I couldn't let this continue. I jumped to my feet and searched for a dungeon monitor. Whoever was running the floor tonight had missed this, or hadn't been watching for long enough to catch it. The submissive needed to come out of the restraints and be checked by someone with medical training, and the dominant needed to be taken off the floor and throttled. I was turning toward the gallery entrance when he set the flogger down, grabbed a fistful of her hair, and yanked her head up. The glass in my hand exploded when I saw the woman's face. It was Isla. The stairs didn't register. The salon floor didn't either. I was at the bench with my hands on the cuffs at her wrists. The man grabbed my arm, and when I drove my fist into his throat, he went down. The arsehole hit the floor with a thud, and I forgot him. My hands were on Isla's wrist cuffs, and the buckles were slick with something. Sweat or the whiskey that had run down my arm from the shattered glass. Blood from my palm smeared the leather as I worked the left one free. Her wrist was raw underneath. I got the right one open, and her arm dropped off the bench. Isla! I put my palm on her face. Her skin was clammy, and her pupils were blown wide. She blinked, but she wasn't focused enough to register who I was. Isla! It's Callan. I'm here. Her eyes opened, but she didn't speak. I crouched and switched to the ankle cuffs. The buckles were tighter than the wrist restraints, and my fingers were wet and shaking. Isla listed sideways on the bench when I got them open. I caught her before she fell over and brought her close to me. The welts I'd seen from the gallery were under my forearm, and I made myself ease the pressure to keep from hurting her worse. Conclave was already crossing the floor, 2 monitors flanking him. His expression was one I'd seen only once before. Cold fury held on by a leash so tight the effort showed in his neck. "Blanket!" I said. One of the monitors had it in my hand before I'd finished the word. I wrapped it around Isla's shoulders. I turned to where the man had gone down. The floor was empty. "The Dom," I said to Conclave. "Dark hair, mid-40s, grey eyes. He was working her with a flogger when I came down from the gallery. I put him on the ground, and he's gone." Conclave's gaze swept the floor. "Lorenzo, find every feed from the last 30 minutes. Every camera, every corridor, every exit." He crouched beside me and looked at Isla's face. His mouth tightened when he saw her pupils. "I'll find him. You have my word." "He drugged her, Marco. She's been drugged, and he was seeing her without consent." Conclave's fists tightened. We'd built the Thistle on the same principles the Chalice operated under. A woman had been violated under his roof, and the man responsible had walked out of his building. There was no way he'd let this go without exhausting every effort to find him. "Back corridor," he said. "Service exit. My car is there. I'll have Enzo drive you to the airfield. Alert Rampart and Lando. They're my detail. Rampart is at the front entrance, Lando at the rear." "Done." Conclave spoke into his mobile in rapid Italian. I lifted her off the bench. Her arms didn't come up around my neck. They hung at her sides, with her fingers loose, the same way they'd hung over the bench grips before I'd seen her face. I adjusted the blanket with one hand and gathered her closer. "You're safe," I said against her hair. "I've got you. You're safe now." She moaned, but didn't speak. Conclave led me through a corridor I hadn't used before. The stone walls were older than the rest of the building, and the passage was narrow enough that I had to angle Isla's legs to keep from hitting them against the wall. At the end of it, a steel door opened onto a courtyard, where a black car was idling. "Take us to the nearest hospital," I said once we were inside. Enzo left the parking area and turned the car onto a wider street. The city was quiet at this hour. The headlights swept across shuttered shop fronts, and the wet cobblestones reflected the street lamps in long streaks. Isla lay with her head on my lap. The chemical smell from whatever they'd given her was nauseating. Each time the car turned, I held her tighter. The hospital was a modern building on a boulevard south of the river. Enzo stopped at the emergency entrance and came around to open my door. I got out, with Isla in my arms. A nurse inside the glass doors saw us and came through before I'd reached them. She spoke in Italian first, then switched to English. I told her that I suspected Isla had been drugged and that she had open wounds on her back. I also told her she'd been in and out of consciousness for approximately 15 minutes and had been briefly responsive only once. When they took her from me, I tried to follow, but was stopped at a set of double doors like I had been with Kiernan. Rampart and Lando arrived a few minutes later. They came through the emergency entrance and sat beside me. "Sir?" Rampart said.